How much does container size play a factor in success? I was at a event last year and I was kind of blown away. I was talking to somebody about broccoli starts and they were growing them in 578 cell trays.
Mm,
So I mean like tiny, tiny. And this is kind of up your way, so for stuff for growing in the Central Valley, like mega farm type things, and they're in there for like 35 days. And as a
mm.
gardener, I mean, I kind of looked at the cell and like, oh my God, that's too small. And I'm thinking like, hey, this thing needs to be swimming in soil. But they're doing this on a big scale. They're very economically motivated to be successful. They've done, thousands and thousands and thousands of trials at this scale. So, hey, it must work for them. But yet intuitively, you're like, hey, that's too small. What are your thoughts on container size at, like, a seeding stage?
That's a good question. What I think about a lot is what I'm asking the root system to do for me, in the crop. So a broccoli, you're looking at a crop that's going to go out and transplant. You're going to get it into probably a well-drained soil, and you want that to grow pretty vigorously. And so you'd be thinking pretty carefully about the speed. You talk about 30 some days, or turning that around quickly, stopping the roots from doing a lot of circling or from developing poor architecture in a tiny space. When I'm growing a tree crop, we grow oaks sometimes here on the Central Coast, some of our Central Coast live oak and some of our classic native plants. We want to think really carefully about that root architecture because you have this plant in a native environment, has incredible drought tolerance and fits the climate well. But if you grow it in the wrong container and you grow the wrong shape root system on that plant, it will not be, a match for the ecosystem. And so in that case, we look at very deep containers to allow the taproot to grow down in the plant. We want to be really cautious about, and this is where it becomes a little interesting. If you want to grow this in a landscape environment, like someone in their front yard, they're going to have modified soil, they want to grow it as a shade tree, you might actually go through and either air prune or physically prune the root system and get it to branch, because that tree is going to be in an artificial environment where it will be cared for like a landscape plant. If you want to do a restoration planting, I would want to be really careful about making sure the taproot was not pruned, that it stayed intact, and that you would get the natural taproot in the root system. So my long-term goal for the use of the plant might influence the type of container I would select, in starting the plant. For something small like a bedding plant, right now, I think a strong driver is what's the goal in terms of automation? What kind of machine will be transplanting it, or person if that's the case, but how quickly do you need to transplant? And I found when I was growing plants back, it's now, I guess, been the late 90s where I was doing lots of crops in the early 2005, 2004. We would often look at the speed to fill out the cell as the determining factor. So we would want, based on our projection for where we were doing transplanting, we would pick our cell size to a good root system in the 4 weeks or the 3 weeks or whatever time frame runway we had to get to that point. The goal being avoiding a pot bound or root bound plant where there's not enough porosity left in the container. The roots have replaced the porosity, and then it becomes very high maintenance, in a greenhouse setting. So we would look to match that sizing based on our production schedule. So I would jump between a 32, a 36, a 48, a 72, a 144, all those plug sizes based on what I expected the timeline to be to transplant.
What's visibly noticeable on a root-bound plant versus a cell that's well filled out?
That's a good question as well. So what I would look at is, if I guess part of this depends if I'm thinking as a homeowner, as a grower in that case, as if you're looking at a plant and trying to determine pot bound versus not pot bound, one big giveaway is you see signs of extreme stress, of just the plant can't get enough water, maybe showing signs of nutrient stress. And that is simply, there is not porosity left in that cell, to support the plant. As I look at the plug, what I would warn people about going to a garden center and buying a plant for their landscape is, take a look. A lot of garden centers really don't want you pulling plants out of pots. I found it's best to ask an associate there of, hey, could I see the root system? They might be shocked. A lot of people probably don't ask that question, but if you know what you're doing and you work with trees and shrubs and containers, it's easy to pop them out and, show a root system, as long as we're not talking about a massive tree box or something, or, ball and burlap plant. But if you can see the root system, what you're looking for are roots that come out to the edges of the container, but don't do a lot of circling or excessive doubling back over each other. When you're looking at them, some people would say, well, more is better. I want to see roots in the whole root ball. What I would look for is not that, but rather lots of potential growth points. You want to see almost like, hands extending out at the edge of the plant where you're seeing all these areas that can grow. Some of the new air pruning pots are amazing. You see them come out of that pot and you just see growth points all up and down that root ball. Is so great to see. I don't remember seeing anything like that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and absolutely beautiful root systems. So I would look to avoid that circling root system and then really look for signs of stress on the the part of the plant you can see above ground.
Yeah, it's like some of those round pots that have like the feet that come down with little recesses, and
Mm,
sometimes you pull the plant out and you can see the roots have
yes,
100% conformed up and down to the shape from so much circling there that they've essentially molded the inside of the pot or plant.
exactly. Exactly. Yes. And then if you are working with a plant that has a woody root system, it's going to be a long-term root system. That's where you'll see some books or, different recommendations will talk about cutting into the root system, cut those roots, but you want to create some new growth points and not have all those double backers. You talk about those pieces underneath. They're going to thicken up, develop secondary growth, and basically girdle themselves or choke themselves out based on that shape.
What are your thoughts on that, cutting it off? Because I've seen both sides. Some people be like, "Hey, it's just going to damage the plant. You're putting it at risk for disease or shock." When you do, let's say you don't have a choice, you get a plant and it's got that on it, all that root circling. Is it better to
Mhm.
shave the sides down and put it in to try and stimulate new growth, or just put it in as is?
Yeah, I would tend for a woody plant, anything that has a woody root system that's going to be perennial year after year, I would tend to do some cutting on that for anything that's circling back, especially circling at the top. But even down lower at the bottom of the pot, if there are things going fully around, I would not tend to shave, everything on the entire plant, but make some vertical cuts, perhaps 4, 5, 6 lengthwise, around the container, and then kind of tease some of those root sections out to get basically you want that finger extension, growing out of the plant. And if it was something that was an herbaceous plant, something that was a one season plant or a shorter timeline, sometimes in those cases I have not cut them, but I've just used my fingers to kind of pull apart a little bit in there and create some outgrowth into the planting hole. And that would be my tendency there. I believe very strongly in the planting hole is critical to success. And so I would really be cautious to promote exploration, in the root system, which would be avoiding smooth sides on the hole and any kind of clay in the soil, watching out for glazing, where if you just take a wet clay and rub your hand over it and you'll kind of create a smooth surface, roots will hit that and just work their way right around the container. So make sure, especially when I have a root system that's looking somewhat pot bound, make sure to have rough surfaces in the planting hole and not smooth sides.
And one thing I've heard before is don't over amend, let's say, the hole you're putting the plant into. So let's say I put in a 5-gallon tree. That the diameter of that pot is 8 inches. So I could dig an 8-inch hole and just drop it in. It's a 1-for-1 fit. It's just like it came out of the pot. So it's straight native soil right next to it. I could also, double it up and have a 16-inch diameter hole. So now there's a bunch of extra space around the side, or 32 inches. I go way bigger,
Mhm.
throw all sorts of fluffy, loose soil in, native soil, and whatever else I have. But then I've heard people say then that just it sets the plan up for failure in the long run, because now it's got this bigger hole with fluffy stuff. It doesn't go out. It's not forced to go out and explore more. Do you think that's valid?
I think there's truth in that. And once again, I would see a relationship to clay soil, where you're basically creating a pot in the ground. When you have that, dig that hole and the amendment. One thing that I would watch out for with amendment, and I would tend to side with the being cautious about amending soil, especially in a small planting hole. One is with compost or some amendments. I spent time in Pennsylvania close to a lot of the mushroom industry, and we use mushroom compost often as an amendment, and it can be very high in salts. And so you'd end up with a very stressful environment in an amended planting hole when you had mushroom soil in the planting hole. What I tend to do personally is to say, if I have the luxury of amending a larger space, if I'm putting in a bed or a landscape bed, can I amend the entire bed? Can I go in and work some topsoil or compost into that so that the entire area is very favorable for root growth? That would be option one I would like to do. If I can't do that, what I would tend to do is dig a hole that I can fill up reliably. So I'm giving myself 6 inches, maybe around the full root zone. So I can make sure I get soil down around the plant. And then I make it look like a star is probably the wrong word, but I would take my shovel and cut irregular shapes pretty quickly. It's not formal, it's not an art project, but I want crevices and different shapes around to start that movement into the soil. And then I might, if the soil is really bad, I might do a very mild amendment, probably nothing too extreme, but just a little bit. In many cases, it would be the native soil right back into place. Where I live right now, I have a very sandy soil and it's very uniform in the entire area I'm working with. So what I tend to do is amend a larger area and I add compost in just to increase water holding, at least for the transplant establishment phase. And I do that.